Today is Sunday, February 19th, 2012, and this is an interview with Admiral Frank Kelso at his home in Fayetteville, Tennessee. He was born on July 11th, 1933. My name is Adam Beasley, and I'll be the interviewer. My dad, Dan Beasley, will be recording this interview. Admiral Kelso, what branch of service did you serve in, and what was your rank?
I served in the U.S. Navy, and I rose to the rank of Admiral.
Okay, what are one or two of the most memorable moments you had while in service?
Well, there were a lot of memorable moments. I guess one that I remember with great pride is the fact that when I qualified in submarines. It's been a long time ago. I've been over 50 years now, but when you go into the submarine service, they have a very rigorous qualification program, and it generally takes about a year to a year and a half for a young officer to qualify. By qualifying, it means that you can now have the responsible position of officer of the deck at sea or submerged, and that everybody on the ship recognizes you as somewhat an expert in submarines now. So that's kind of your first step in submarines, and I suppose that was as good an event as I can remember in reality in my service. I guess the other period of time that I had remembered quite vividly and with some pride is the period of time when I was commander of the 6th Fleet in the Mediterranean in the middle 80s, when the U.S. was for the first time beginning to deal with the terrorist activities in the world. And we were busy throughout my period of about 2 years as Commander 6th Fleet with things like the Achille Lauro hijacking, the bombing of Libya after the Libyans had clearly caused harm to Americans in Europe, both in Germany as well as in Italy. And I happened to have been the commander during that period of time where action was taking place, and we generally were fairly successful in our actions.
That's awesome. What was your family like growing up?
Well, I'm an only child, so I didn't have any siblings to argue with, but I was a very lucky child. We weren't rich by any stretch of the imagination. I grew up actually, as a young child, I grew up during the Depression, and all of my family, but I lived within 50 yards of my grandmother and grandfather and my aunt and uncle, so I basically had 3 places to have dinner if I wanted to, and I could go sample whatever dinner was good that night, and I was about the only boy of that age in the family, so I had a pretty nice life, and from that standpoint, school for me was good. I was able to do reasonably well in school, and my mother was really wanted to ensure that I got an education at the college level, because nobody in her family had ever had, and she had always regretted that she didn't get a college education, and so she made sure I did pretty well in school on that. But I have nothing. My grandfather I was named after my grandfather. He was a wonderful old man, and he was very happy to have me around, and I spent a lot of time with him growing up, and he piddled around on farms and other things, and he was very good with his hands, so he taught me how to do a lot of things that I remember throughout my life as a young boy. And my grandmother on the other side of the family, my mother's mother, lived with us, and my mother worked, so she somewhat was a surrogate parent during the day when I was a little boy growing up, and I had great respect and love for her, of course, and so I was a very fortunate child to grow up in a family that loved me and cared for me and wanted to make sure that I did well.
Yes, sir. Why did you decide to pursue a naval career, and what influenced that decision?
Well, that's a harder question to answer. Well, I grew up as a young boy during the Second World War. All of my all of my ancestors and kinfolks that were in the Second World War were in the Navy, and I guess that had an influence on me. And as a result of that, I was always interested in the movies about the Navy during the war and about Annapolis and places like that. So I also saw a route in the Navy as a young boy. It was a way to get an education without a great deal of stress on my parents, and Annapolis offered that opportunity, and so I somehow decided I wanted to go to Annapolis, and my uncle was able to secure an appointment through one of the political leaders in the state, and I made it to Annapolis. So from there on, I guess it was experiences that I had that continued to keep me in the Navy. When each of those opportunities come to leave after your contract is up, I just always stayed there and kept doing my job because I liked what I was doing.
Yes, sir. What is the most beautiful place you saw while in service?
Well, there are a lot of pretty places in the world, and of course this country probably has as many as any. Most of your career as a naval officer is on the coast, and not too many ports and for ships in the internal part of the country. If you're talking about throughout the world, there are a lot of beautiful places. I remember going to Rio de Janeiro in '55 on a cruise. It was an absolutely gorgeous place. Sydney, Australia is an incredibly beautiful place to visit. And I've been to Japan and Korea and really India, Pakistan, that part, and not too much in Africa. We don't go too much in Africa, but the world has a lot of beautiful spots to see. Hong Kong, at that point in time, was an absolutely gorgeous place. The beaches and all were not all that populated. When we went to Hawaii for the first time to live in 1958, there were only 2 hotels on Oahu. So the beach was pristine, you know, there was no concrete jungle like it is today. And Maui was just there was nothing in the valley to amount to anything but what was known as the old Whalers Inn. It got its name because that's exactly, whalers stayed there when they came to Hawaii for whaling in those days. And the cracks in the floor were about like that, but it still was a great place to stay, and we'd spend a weekend over there sometimes. So, yeah, you know, the world is your oyster, and wherever you are is pretty in many ways.
Yes, sir. What are some of the famous people you met while in service?
Well, I met quite a few people I think you would consider famous. I met 3 of our presidents, Reagan, George Bush, the first President Bush, and Mr. Clinton. They're all impressive people in many ways, and of course all of those people who were secretaries of defense and those kind of jobs during the period of time I was in Washington, which was about 10 years of my career. Many of the people in the Congress of the U.S. were new and could converse with, both business and sometimes for pleasure. I had a wonderful lunch with Margaret Thatcher one day, and she was an imposing lady and very interesting to talk to. When I traveled in Europe as a very senior officer, and as a part of NATO, we quite often called on the heads of state, people like the King of Norway, the Queen of Denmark, the Queen of Holland, the Chancellor of Germany, lots of people like that who I think you would consider famous people. And not that it was because of me, it was just because of the job I was in more than anything else.
Can you describe the most memorable naval operation you were a part of?
Well, I guess the most memorable was a period of time where we were acting against Libya in the middle 80s. It was a period of several weeks where we were involved in conflict at sea and bombing Libya during that period of time.
What was the most difficult decision you had to make concerning a military operation?
Well, every decision you make where you're going to put young people in harm's way are difficult decisions. You make them because your job as an officer in the military is to carry out the mission that you're given, and the mission you're given is normally given by the leadership of the country, but then somebody's got to tell Charlie he's going to go out and get shot at maybe. And any of those decisions are hard because you recognize that you may lose some of them, or they may get wounded or hurt, and you don't like that idea very much. But there's no way to do the job without putting them at risk, and those decisions are difficult.
What were the best and worst parts about being in the Navy?
Well, the worst part was being away from your family. The best part's that you're away from the telephone quite often. And so you're out there in the Navy in a way, you're on your own, you're at sea. The commanding officer of the ship, the decisions are yours to make. And so it's that kind of an environment. And you're doing things that you feel are important to do. And so I guess, as I say, it's clear the worst part is the separation from your family. That I figure I probably spent 7 years underwater of my life, and so you miss a lot of graduations and those sort of things, and births sometimes as well in your family.
If you could be remembered for one thing you did in the military, what would it be?
Being fair to the people that work for me, and honest with them.
What did the Navy teach you about how to effectively lead those under you?
Well, I've spent 38 years in the Navy, and you learn a lot after 38 years. You make a lot of mistakes. What I learned was that you can't do anything by yourself if you're going to lead people. That they have to want, you have to get them to buy into the job that you're asking them to do by convincing them this is something that they need to do, maybe they're required to do, and that they want to do well. And my experience was that most everybody really wants to do well, and how they're led determines what they do in many cases. So I think that lesson that I learned very young as a young officer was that, hey, I can't get this job done alone. I can try, and I might do part of it well, but the job gets too big for you. You have to have other people to help in order to carry out the job that's necessary that you do to complete your mission. And I carry that all through my life. Even today, if I'm trying to do something, I remember that I'm not going to get it done very well unless the people that are supporting me, they may not be working for me, they may be volunteering in today's world, are willing to listen and to try to do it well.
Was there anybody you worked alongside or that helped you out that was especially helpful that you really remember to this day that helped you accomplish something?
Oh, well, there's a myriad of those people because, one of the things people don't understand about the military is that you probably spend more time as a teacher than you do anything else because you're always turning over people into the job. There are young people on the ship, for example, you turn over a third of the crew once a year. So you're always training, educating a new group of people, and that requires education and training, maybe hands-on only, maybe learning from a book, maybe learning today from a computer or whatever it might be. And so you end up spending a lot of your time helping other people to find out how to do their job and do it well. Repeat that question again for me.
Who was someone you worked alongside that was especially helpful?
So my point is that it was everybody. You know, I could pick up 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7, but I don't want to single out anybody like that, because after the period of time I spent, there were just hundreds and hundreds of people, maybe even thousands, that were necessary and that I remember for doing the job and doing it well.
How did your time in service change or affect you?
Well, I don't know that much to do with the time in service, but I got a little older. Yeah. Well, the experiences you have, no matter what you do, are going to affect your life and how you see it. It's going to affect how you think about it. The things that you learn are going to cause you to see things differently than you did early on. So there is a set of experiences which you learn that change your outlook on many things. You know, when you're young, you think you've got it all. You know a lot. You learn. You learn later on that. I wish I'd learned a lot more along the way. I guess if I had it to do over again, I'd read a lot more as a young man, because I believe I would have been more effective in some areas, and my thought process would have been better had I learned more American history, for example. Had I learned more about the politics of our country, how it operated, and those sort of things, all of which you can get from a big book. You just have to take the time to study it. And I don't think I did enough of that along the way. I wish I had been smarter about what I read as I came along in life. And I've learned a lot more after I retired than I wished I'd have learned it before I retired, is what I'm trying to tell you. Because I do have the time to read more now.
So what was your job in Washington? Can you describe that for me?
Well, I had several jobs in Washington. The first job I had in Washington was the senior officer who works in the Chief of Naval Personnel's office. His office is responsible for policies for assignment and the assignment of people. And my job was to assign people to submarines, nuclear ships like carriers, nuclear carriers, and to set the policies for those. I don't mean that I set the policy without supervision, but I generally proposed the policies, and they told me whether I was done or not. And we went and did what was necessary to be done to do that. I was responsible for the planning for recruiting of those people, how many we needed, for sending them through their training, for deciding, recommended who was going to be skippers of ships, those sort of things. So that was my first job. I was about 3 years into that. And then I was assigned to the office of the Chief of Naval Operations as a lower level admiral. This was my first job as an admiral. And my job was to, supervise is not a very good word, is to oversee, I guess, provide planning for the strategic submarine force. When I say strategic, I mean those submarines that fire ballistic missiles. And we were building a new missile at the time called the D-5, which is still in operation, and we were building a new kind of submarine called Trident. And so my job was to see that we put sufficient money in the budget, that we were able to convince the Congress to get that, to appropriate and authorize that money for those submarines, and to see that the people that were building them were asking for a reasonable amount of money, not too much and not too little. So I was in that job about 3 years. And then I went to work for the Secretary of the Navy. The Navy has a senior officer in charge called the Chief of Naval Operations. Above him is a civilian appointed by the President and approved by the Congress, known as the Secretary of the Navy. Now his boss is the Secretary of Defense. So it's Secretary of Navy, Secretary of Defense, and then the President, okay? So I worked in his office as an advisor to the Secretary on naval matters, again, about how much we were going to spend on all programs of the Navy now, not just submarines, but those sort of things, and to give him advice as to how, you know, on those sort of issues within the Navy. And I was there about 3 years, and from there, and so I was there about 6 years that time. The next time I came back was to be the Chief of Naval Operations, and that job is a 4-year job in the Navy. The Chief of Naval Operations is fundamentally responsible for, how do I put it simply? He's responsible for the training, education, maintenance, setting the requirements for the Navy for how many ships you need, how many people you need, those sort of things, and then to convince people that that's what we need to do as far as the Navy is concerned. And I was in that job 4 years. It's a 4-year job.
What was the best advice you ever received from someone above you?
Well, it's pretty simple advice. I went when I was a fairly young officer. I was chosen to go run one of our nuclear power schools. This is a school that trained officers and enlisted personnel. 6 months in length was a school, maybe 25 to 3,000 people in school. And at the time, the boss was Admiral who was a rather famous old man. You probably never heard of him, but a lot of people have. And I went by to see him on the way to the job, and I thought he would give me hours of directions. You know what he told me? He says, "You go run that place like you run it, like you own it." That's probably the best advice I ever got. If you do your job like you own it, then that's probably about as good advice as you're going to get. Because if you own it and your life depends on it, you're going to do the best you can. And I've always thought, you know, of all the advice I got, that was as good as any. Do it, and what it's really saying is do it as best you can.
Yes, sir. That's great advice. Is there any other advice you would give to me or any other young people about how to take your experiences and better ourselves?
Well, it's pretty obvious. At your age, get the best education you can. Okay? And play the game of life honestly. You know, the truth often hurts, but you have to tell it earlier. It smells worse all the time. And so stick with the truth and don't be pulled away from it, because in the end, it's always going to do you the best. Has been my experiences. Tell it like it is. People then know who you are, and you don't have to remember what you said, because you'll remember it truthfully. You know, if you start covering up, then it's hard to keep covering up the things that you're covering up, and treat everybody fairly. And life is not fair. I don't mean to point out that to you necessarily, but every human being deserves an opportunity to do and express their capabilities and what they want to do in life, and you can be a part of that and be helpful with it. Helpful sometimes means you don't necessarily agree with them, or tell them you agree with them, because telling them you agree with them when they're flat wrong is giving them the wrong impression. But to be straightforward with them, I think, is the best approach in life. And So I could spend all day answering that question, but I won't tell you anything any better than what I've told you in a few seconds.
Yes, sir. Is there anything else you want to say or talk about?
No, not really. I'm delighted to meet you, and I'm happy to see that your school wants you to go talk to somebody, not necessarily me, but somebody who's had the experiences of life to be able to help you shape your experiences. And that's a good idea. You know, old people sometimes are not very fast and don't move too swiftly, but God thankfully has let me think reasonably straight so far, and I think you can learn a lot by listening to people who have been around and seen things, and I think that's a good idea.
All right. Well, thank you very much. That's
I'm
the end of the interview.
Happy to meet you.
Yes, sir.
I like the Beasley bunch. Your grandmother and grandfather are nice.